The day my daughter-in-law told me I wasn't allowed to see my own grandson, I stood in my kitchen holding a dish towel that had gone cold and damp in my hands. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the way the afternoon light slanted across the counter, and how quiet the house suddenly felt. Too quiet, like it was holding its breath with me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were calm, polite even. "I think it's best if you don't come by for a while," she said. "The baby needs stability." Stability. I had raised 3 children in that very house. I had rocked my son through colic and fevers and heartbreaks. I had held him when his father died too young, my tears soaking into his hair as I whispered promises I didn't know how I'd keep. And now I was being told by a woman half my age that I was a disruption. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Just air, just disbelief. Because what she didn't know was this: I had already seen something, and once you see certain things, you can't unsee them. Before all of this, my life was quiet, not lonely, quiet in the way a settled lake is quiet, predictable, peaceful, earned. I lived alone in the same modest, sun-worn house my late husband and I bought when our oldest was still in diapers. The paint on the porch was chipped, and the 3rd step always creaked, but it was home. It smelled like lemon polish and old books. On Sundays, I cooked more than I needed out of habit: pots of beans, cornbread, sometimes a roast if my joints weren't acting up. My son Daniel was my youngest. He used to call me every evening on his drive home from work, even after he moved out. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all: traffic, the weather, a coworker who annoyed him. Sometimes he just stayed on the line, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. When he told me he was dating someone seriously, I was careful not to pry. I'd learned, as a mother, that too much interest could feel like pressure. Still, I asked the important things. Was she kind? Did she make him laugh? "She's organized," he said once after a pause. "Very put together." That should have been my first clue. I met Rachel 6 months later, on a Sunday afternoon. She arrived 10 minutes early, heels clicking on my front porch like she was walking into a job interview. Her smile was perfect, teeth straight, lips practiced. She brought a store-bought cake and apologized twice for it not being homemade. "I'm just not much of a baker," she said, laughing lightly. She barely touched her slice. Rachel was polite, impeccably so. She called me Mrs. Carter even when I told her she could call me by my first name. She complimented my curtains, my cooking, my garden, but it all felt rehearsed, like she'd studied how to be agreeable. Still, Daniel looked at her with something close to relief, as if she had brought order into parts of his life that felt messy. After his father died, Daniel had carried a quiet weight I could never fully lift. Maybe Rachel balanced him. When they married, it was small. Courthouse, immediate family. Rachel insisted it be low stress. I wore a blue dress I'd had from church days and cried quietly while they signed the papers. Things changed after the baby was born. At first, it was subtle: shorter phone calls, missed visits. Rachel always had a reason: feeding schedule, nap time, doctor's orders. I understood. I really did. I remembered those days, the exhaustion that felt bone deep. But then came the rules. No kissing the baby. Please wash your hands again. Let's keep visits under 30 minutes. Each request reasonable on its own. Together they formed a wall I kept bumping into. Daniel stopped calling on his drive home. When I asked him about it, he said work had been busy. Rachel hovered during my visits, correcting how I held the baby, how I spoke to him, even the lullaby I hummed under my breath. "That song is a little outdated," she said gently, removing the baby from my arms. "We're trying to stimulate him with newer sounds." I laughed it off, or tried to. Then, one afternoon, I stopped by unannounced, not to intrude, just to drop off a bag of baby clothes I'd found in the attic. Daniel used to wear them, soft cotton, faded ducks. Rachel opened the door just a crack. "Oh," she said, surprise flickering across her face before it smoothed out. "We weren't expecting you." "I won't stay," I said. "Just wanted to drop these off." Behind her, I heard the baby cry, sharp, unsettled. Rachel stepped outside and closed the door behind her. "That's really not necessary," she said, her voice firm now. "We have plenty." I noticed then how her hands trembled slightly, how her eyes flicked toward the windows like she was making sure they were covered. "I'll just leave them here," I said, setting the bag down. She picked it up immediately and placed it back into my arms. "Please," she said, "we need boundaries." Boundaries? I drove home with the bag still in my lap, the baby's cry echoing in my ears long after it should have faded. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt different, too empty, too alert. Around midnight, I made tea and stood at the window staring out at the street, and that's when I saw Daniel's car pull into their driveway. Something compelled me to drive by the next day. I told myself it was foolish, that I was being paranoid, but my gut had started whispering, and I learned over the years that ignoring it came at a cost. I parked across the street, just for a moment, just to reassure myself. That's when I saw the curtains move, and what I saw through that small opening would change everything I thought I knew about my son's life and why I was no longer welcome in it.
I didn't see much at first, just shapes, movement, a blur of pale walls and shadows passing by the window. I told myself to leave, to start the car and go home, but my body wouldn't listen. My hands stayed wrapped around the steering wheel, knuckles whitening as I leaned forward slightly, like that would sharpen the picture. The curtain shifted again. This time, I saw Rachel. She was standing in the living room, her back to the window, rocking the baby. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical. Not the loose sway of a tired mother, but something rehearsed, counted. 1, 2, 3. The baby cried harder. Rachel stopped rocking. She looked down at him, her mouth tightening. Then she did something that made my chest seize so suddenly I had to suck in a breath. She didn't soothe him. She didn't pat his back or murmur softly or check his diaper. She held him away from her body, arms extended, as if he were heavier than he should have been, as if she needed distance. Then she spoke. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I saw her face. The smile was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger exactly. It was irritation. Sharp, controlled, cold. The baby's cries rose in pitch, tiny fists flailing. Rachel glanced toward the hallway, then toward the front door, toward the street, toward me, though she didn't see me. Finally, she bounced him once, sharply, and the crying cut off into a startled hiccup. I flinched. My heart began to pound so loudly I was afraid it would carry through the windshield. Daniel appeared a moment later, stepping into the room with his phone still in his hand. Rachel turned immediately, her posture changing, her shoulders softened, her face rearranged itself into concern. She handed the baby to Daniel. And then, this part stays with me, she smiled. I didn't wait to see more. I drove away shaking, my foot barely steady on the pedal. The world outside blurred, colors smearing together like wet paint. I kept seeing that moment in my mind, the way her arms had stiffened, the way she'd held my grandson away from her chest. I told myself I was overreacting. I had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. That night, I replayed every interaction I'd had with Rachel since the baby was born, every correction, every rule, every insistence on control. No drop-in visits, no holding him unless I say it's okay, no pictures posted online. At the time, it had felt excessive but harmless, protective maybe. Now it felt like something else, like management.
I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the old ceiling fan click around and around, my husband's side still empty after all these years. Around 3 in the morning, I whispered his name into the dark. "I don't know what to do," I said. There was no answer, just the soft hum of the fan and the ache in my chest. The next morning, I called Daniel. He sounded tired, distracted. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I lied. "I just wanted to check in. How's the baby?" There was a pause, a beat too long. "He's fine," Daniel said. "Why?" "Oh, no reason. I was thinking of coming by this weekend." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll have to ask Rachel," he said carefully. "She's been really focused on keeping things calm." Calm. I closed my eyes. "Daniel," I said gently, "are you okay?" "I'm fine," he repeated. "Really. We're just adjusting." I almost told him what I'd seen, the words pressed against my throat, desperate to escape. But something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or instinct. If I accused his wife without proof, I could lose him forever. "I love you," I said instead. "I love you too, Mom." But his voice sounded far away, like he was already halfway gone. A few days later, Rachel called me. That alone was unusual. "I wanted to talk," she said, her tone smooth and measured, "about expectations." I sat at my kitchen table, hands folded around a mug I wasn't drinking from. "Okay," I said. She continued, "It's best if we take a break from visits for a while. The baby senses tension, and we're trying to create a stable environment." There it was again, that word, stability. "I don't understand. What tension?" She sighed softly, like she was speaking to a child. "Sometimes grandparents can overstep without realizing it." I thought of myself standing in their doorway with a bag of old baby clothes, of rocking chairs and lullabies and Sunday dinners. "I would never hurt that child," I said, my voice shaking now. She replied quickly, "I'm not saying you would, but intention and impact aren't the same." The line went quiet for a second. Then she said it. "So for now, I think it's best if you don't come by." I felt something inside me settle then. Not peace, not anger, clarity. After we hung up, I sat very still. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second landing like a footstep. I thought of the way Rachel had looked at the baby through that window, the way her face had hardened when she thought no one was watching. I knew then that this wasn't about boundaries. It was about hiding. That afternoon, I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I began to pay attention. I spoke to my neighbor who lived down the street from Daniel, asked casual questions. Did she ever hear the baby crying? Did she see Rachel much? "The curtains keep closed," she said, frowning slightly, "even during the day." I requested a copy of the baby's pediatric visit schedule from Daniel under the guise of wanting to help. I noticed how often appointments were missed, rescheduled. I started writing things down, dates, times, patterns, because if Rachel thought keeping me away would protect her, she was wrong, and I was just beginning to understand why she was so afraid of me seeing my grandson. Once I started paying attention, the world rearranged itself around the things I had been trying not to see. I noticed how Rachel never sent pictures anymore, how every photo Daniel posted showed the baby swaddled tightly, face half turned away. I noticed how Daniel's voice changed when Rachel was nearby, lower, careful, like he was choosing each word from a narrow list of approved options. I noticed myself changing too. I became quieter, more deliberate. I stopped calling so often, stopped pushing. I knew now that patience wasn't surrender, it was preparation. The real discovery didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, the way truth usually does, small enough to ignore, sharp enough to hurt. It began with a missed doctor's appointment. Daniel had mentioned casually that the baby had a routine checkup scheduled for Thursday morning. I offered to drive them, thinking it might be an opening. Rachel declined immediately. "That won't be necessary," she said. "We've got it handled." On Friday, I called Daniel and asked how the appointment went. Silence. "Oh," he said finally, "we, had to reschedule." "For when?" "Next week." I hung up and stared at the phone long after the call ended. That night, I did something I'm not proud of, but I will never apologize for. I drove by their house again. This time it was evening. The street lights were on, glowing amber against the quiet cul-de-sac. Their living room was dark, but a faint light spilled from the nursery window upstairs. I parked farther down, out of habit now. At first, there was nothing. Then, crying. Not the soft, needy cry of a hungry baby. This was sharp, panicked. It rose and fell in broken waves, like the baby was running out of breath between each wail. I counted the seconds without meaning to. 10, 20, 30. The crying didn't stop. My heart began to hammer. I watched the nursery window, no movement, no shadow crossing the curtains. Then I saw Rachel. She stepped into the room, her silhouette stark against the light. She leaned over the crib, hands gripping the rail, her head tilted, listening. The crying continued. She straightened, and she walked out. I felt dizzy. I don't know how long I sat there after that. Long enough for the streetlight to flicker, long enough for my legs to go numb, long enough for my mind to run through every excuse it could find. She's overwhelmed, she's exhausted, all mothers struggle. But none of those excuses explained the stillness of her body, the deliberateness of her movements, the way she had listened and chosen not to respond. I went home shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor of my living room and press my back against the couch. I thought of Daniel as a baby, his cries slicing through my sleep, my bones aching as I lifted him again and again. I thought of how instinct had driven me, how even in exhaustion something deeper had answered. This wasn't that. The next morning I called Child Protective Services. My voice shook as I spoke. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. I described exactly what I had seen and heard, dates, times, observations. The woman on the other end listened carefully. "We'll look into it," she said gently. "You did the right thing by calling." I hung up and cried for an hour. Not because I doubted my choice, but because I knew what it might cost me. 3 days later, Daniel showed up at my door. He looked smaller somehow. His shoulders slumped, dark circles carved shadows under his eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, "why didn't you tell me?" I stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled of coffee and old wood, familiar, safe. "I tried," I said softly, "but you weren't listening." He sat heavily at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he pressed them together. "They came," he said, "CPS. They asked questions. They looked around." I nodded. Rachel had told him it was harassment, a misunderstanding, someone overreacting. "But then," Daniel continued, his voice breaking, "they showed me the footage." I froze. "Footage?" Daniel swallowed hard. "We installed cameras in the nursery when he was born. Rachel said it was for safety, monitoring." My chest tightened. "They showed me clips," he said, "times when he was crying and she didn't go to him, times when she turned the sound off." The room felt suddenly very small. "He said he needed to learn to self-soothe," she said. "Too much comfort would make him weak." I reached across the table and took his hands. They were cold. "There's more," he said, pulling his hands away. "She deleted parts of the footage. The investigator recovered them." He closed his eyes. "She was leaving him alone for hours, sometimes all day." My breath hitched. "And the doctor's appointments?" I asked quietly. Daniel nodded. She didn't want anyone asking questions. She told me they were unnecessary. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his eyes red and raw. She told me you were trying to undermine me, that you were dangerous. I felt the weight of that settle over me, the weeks of silence, the distance, the exclusion. I would have never, he began. I know. Rachel didn't come with him that day. She was removed from the house pending investigation, temporarily, they said, for the baby's safety. The baby came home with Daniel that night. I watched from my kitchen window as Daniel carried his son into my house, holding him close to his chest, his face pressed protectively against the baby's soft head. When he handed him to me, the baby stilled almost instantly. His tiny body relaxed against mine, a sigh escaping his lips. I felt tears slide down my cheeks and drip onto the blanket. Rachel had been right about one thing. The baby did need stability. But it wasn't distance he needed. It was love. The first night my grandson slept under my roof, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the rocking chair by the window, the same one I'd used decades ago with Daniel, my arms curved carefully around this new, fragile life. The house felt different with him there, alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Every sound startled me. Every small breath made me lean in closer. Daniel lay on the couch in the living room, fully dressed, exhaustion finally pulling him under around 2 a.m. I watched his chest rise and fall, his brow still furrowed even in sleep, like his mind hadn't caught up with the safety of the moment yet. Neither had mine. At dawn, I brewed coffee and watched the sky lighten. The baby stirred, his face scrunching in that familiar way that always came just before tears. I lifted him instinctively, humming low and slow. He calmed almost immediately. It broke my heart how quickly he responded to gentleness. Daniel watched us from the doorway, his eyes glossy. "He never settles like that with me," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I just kept humming. The next few days were a blur of appointments and paperwork, CPS visits, pediatric checkups, evaluations I didn't fully understand but trusted nonetheless. The doctor confirmed what we had all suspected but hoped wasn't true. The baby was underweight. Not dangerously, not yet, but enough to raise concern, enough to validate everything I had seen and felt. Daniel blamed himself relentlessly. "I should have known," he said one evening, his voice hollow as he stared at his son sleeping in the bassinet. "I should have paid attention." "You trusted your wife," I said gently. "That's not a crime." He shook his head. "She didn't just lie to me," he said. "She used me." Rachel, for her part, tried to contact us. At first, it was long messages, emails filled with explanations and carefully worded apologies. She blamed postpartum anxiety, claimed exhaustion, claimed ignorance. Then the tone shifted. She accused me of interference, of manipulation, of turning Daniel against her. "I know what she's doing," she wrote in one message I accidentally saw when Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. "She's always wanted to replace me." I felt a familiar ache then. Not anger, grief. Because somewhere along the way, Rachel had decided I was her enemy, and in that decision, she had endangered her own child. Daniel met with a lawyer. Custody arrangements were discussed. Temporary orders were put in place. Rachel was allowed supervised visits only. The first time she came to see the baby under supervision, I wasn't present. I didn't trust myself to be. Daniel told me later that she cried the entire visit, held the baby stiffly, asked more questions about how she was being perceived than how the baby was doing. "What do they think of me?" she kept asking. "Do they understand?" The baby cried the entire visit. After that, Daniel made a decision. He moved back in with me. "I can't be there right now," he said simply. "Not in that house." We turned my spare bedroom into a nursery, pale yellow walls, a small crib we found secondhand but solid. I washed every sheet twice, the scent of clean cotton filling the room. Slowly, the baby changed. He gained weight, his cries softened. He began to make those small, surprised sounds babies make when they discover something new. Light, a shadow, the curve of a smile. Daniel changed too. He laughed more, slept better. He learned how to hold his son without fear, how to soothe him, how to be present without looking over his shoulder. One evening, about a month in, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table. "I need to say something," he said. I looked up from my tea. "I'm sorry," his voice thick, "for shutting you out, for believing things." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You were protecting your family," I said gently. "You just didn't realize who needed protecting." He shook his head. "She didn't just lie to me," he said. "She used me." Rachel, for her part, unfolded slowly, as they often do. Parenting classes were mandated, therapy, evaluations. The court listened carefully. She wasn't painted as a monster. She was painted as unprepared, unwilling to adapt, too focused on control to offer care. And that, I realized, was justice enough. The public consequence. The hardest part of all of this wasn't what happened behind closed doors. It was what happened once those doors opened. Word travels fast in quiet neighborhoods, and even faster in families. At first, people were careful around me. Their voices softened. Their questions came wrapped in concern instead of curiosity. "I heard things have been difficult," someone would say. "Let me know if you need anything." But then the story began to change shape. Rachel's version started circulating. She told friends and some family that I had overstepped, that I had interfered, that I had never liked her and had finally found a way to push her out. She used words like controlling and manipulative. She said I had always wanted Daniel back under my roof. I heard this not from strangers, but from people I had known for years. A cousin called one afternoon and asked, carefully, "Did you really call CPS on your own daughter-in-law?" "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "Well, don't you think that was a little extreme?" I closed my eyes before answering. "I think letting a baby cry alone for hours is extreme," I said. The line went quiet. Not everyone took Rachel's side, but not everyone took ours either. Some people prefer stories with clear villains and clean endings. This one made them uncomfortable. Rachel looked polished in public, calm, articulate. She cried at the right moments. She talked about postpartum anxiety and feeling unsupported. And to be fair, she had been struggling. But struggle doesn't excuse harm. The court hearings were exhausting, long days sitting on wooden benches, listening to professionals speak in careful language about things that made my stomach knot. Daniel testified, so did I. I kept my voice steady. I described what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had documented. Rachel avoided looking at me. When she did, her eyes weren't angry, they were accusing, as if I had stolen something from her. When the judge ruled to continue supervised visitation only, Rachel broke down. Her shoulders shook. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm. Daniel didn't celebrate. He just exhaled. Afterward, in the hallway, Rachel approached me for the first time since everything had come out. Up close, she looked smaller than I remembered, thinner. The polish was still there, but it couldn't hide the cracks. "You wanted this," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "No," I replied. "I wanted him safe." Her mouth tightened. "You never liked me," she said. I thought about that for a moment. "I didn't know you well enough to like or dislike you, but I trusted you with my son's child." She flinched. That was the last real conversation we had. The rest of the consequences unfolded in smaller, quieter ways. Rachel lost friends who couldn't reconcile her story with the evidence, family members began asking harder questions, invitations stopped coming. Daniel filed for divorce. That was harder than I expected it to be. Not because I thought he should stay, but because it meant mourning the future he had imagined, the intact family, the shared milestones, the picture he'd carried quietly in his heart. Some nights I found him sitting on the porch long after the baby was asleep, staring out into the dark. "I feel like I failed," he admitted once. "You learned. That's not failure." The baby continued to thrive. He smiled more, laughed, slept through the night. He learned my voice, turning his head when I entered the room, his eyes lighting up in a way that still took my breath away. People noticed. At church, at the grocery store, neighbors would comment, "He looks so happy. He's doing so well." I smiled politely and said thank you. I didn't explain. Not everyone deserves the whole story. What surprised me most was how Rachel's absence didn't leave the hole everyone expected. The house didn't feel broken. It felt honest, messy, tired, real. Daniel and I found a rhythm that felt new and old at the same time. We took turns with night feedings. We laughed at things that would have once seemed small. We argued occasionally, then talked it through. One afternoon, while folding tiny socks at the kitchen table, Daniel looked up and said, "I don't think I ever thanked you." I paused. "For what?" I asked. "For being brave enough to see what I didn't, for not backing down when it would have been easier." I set the socks down and reached for his hand. That's what mothers do, even when it costs them. The world didn't clap. There was no grand vindication, just quiet understanding from the people that mattered. And that, I learned, is what real justice often looks like.
Time did what it always does. It moved forward, whether we felt ready or not. The seasons changed outside my windows, one folding into the next. The baby learned to sit, then crawl, then pull himself up on unsteady legs that made my heart leap into my throat every time he wobbled. We laughed more. Not the careful laughter of people afraid to break something fragile, but the easy kind that comes when trust has been rebuilt from the inside out. Daniel started therapy. At first, he went out of obligation, court recommendations, well-meaning suggestions, but soon he went because he wanted to, because he needed a place where he could unpack the weight he'd been carrying since his father died, since becoming a husband, since becoming a father. One evening, he came home quieter than usual. "She asked me why I didn't notice sooner," he said, setting his keys down slowly, "and I didn't have an answer." I sat with him at the kitchen table, the same one where so many conversations had unfolded. Sometimes love makes us blind, and sometimes fear makes us obedient. He nodded. "I won't do that again," he said. The divorce finalized in late autumn. There was no celebration, just a sense of closing a door that had never really been opened the way it should have been. Rachel was granted limited, supervised visitation once a week. She showed up on time. She followed the rules. She seemed quieter. I watched from a distance, not out of spite, but out of respect for the process. I didn't interfere. I didn't comment. I let professionals do what they were trained to do. Rachel didn't look at me anymore, and I didn't need her to. What I needed, what we needed, was peace. One afternoon, as I rocked my grandson to sleep, I realized something that stopped me mid-motion. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not afraid of losing Daniel, not afraid of being shut out, not afraid of being misunderstood. I had stood in the fire and come out with my integrity intact. That gave me a quiet strength I hadn't known I still possessed. Daniel noticed the change too. "You're different," he said one evening as we washed dishes side by side. "So are you," I replied. He smiled. "Maybe that's the point," he said. The house adapted to its new life,
toys scattered the living room, bottles lined the drying rack. My once quiet mornings now began with babbling sounds and tiny hands patting my face far too early, and I welcomed it. I found joy in the ordinary again, in warm baths, in bedtime stories read slowly, in watching my son become the kind of father his own father would have been proud of. Rachel remained a part of our lives, but no longer the center. That shift mattered. I didn't hate her. I couldn't. Hatred would have meant carrying her with me longer than necessary. Instead, I allowed her to fade into the background of our story, where she belonged. I sometimes wondered what she thought now, whether she understood the depth of what she'd risked, whether she regretted it. But those questions didn't keep me up at night. What kept me grounded was the present. One evening, after putting the baby to bed, Daniel sat with me on the porch. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gray. "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" he asked. I considered that carefully. "I wish you hadn't been hurt. I wish your son hadn't suffered, but I don't wish I'd stayed silent." He nodded slowly. "I used to think keeping the peace was the most important thing. Now I think it's keeping people safe." I smiled. "That's wisdom. It usually comes wrapped in pain." The baby stirred inside, a soft cry echoing through the open window. Daniel stood immediately, instinct guiding him now without hesitation. I watched him go, my heart full in a way I hadn't felt in years. Life hadn't returned to what it was before. It had become something better, something honest, something strong. There's a certain kind of quiet that settles into a house once the lights are dimmed and everyone is finally asleep. It isn't empty. It's full of breath, of memory, of things that almost happened and things that did. On nights like that, I sit at the edge of my bed and listen to the soft hum of the heater, to the faint, steady breathing of my grandson down the hall, to the sound of my own heart, still capable of being startled by how much love it holds. I think back to that day in my kitchen, the dish towel damp in my hands, the word stability hanging in the air like an accusation. I remember how small I felt then, how unsure, how afraid that standing up for myself would cost me my son forever. What I didn't understand at the time was this: silence would have cost me much more. We're taught, especially as mothers, to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to swallow our instincts if they make other people uncomfortable. We're told that being loving means being quiet. But love isn't quiet when something is wrong. Love is observant. Love is brave. And sometimes love is willing to be misunderstood. I didn't act because I wanted control. I acted because something in me, the same thing that once woke me from sleep when my own baby cried, refused to be ignored. That instinct doesn't disappear with age. It just gets buried under politeness and doubt and the fear of being labeled difficult. I think about Rachel sometimes, not with anger, but with a kind of sober sadness. I believe she wanted to be a good mother. I believe she wanted things to look right, feel orderly, stay within her control. But babies aren't projects. They aren't reflections of our image. They are small, fragile humans who need warmth more than structure and presence more than perfection. I hope she's learning that now. As for me, I've learned something too. I've learned that being a grandmother doesn't mean stepping aside. It means standing ready, quietly, watchfully, willing to step forward when it matters, even if your hands are shaking when you do. Daniel tells me sometimes that he doesn't know how he would have survived this without me. I always tell him the truth. You would have, I say, but you didn't have to do it alone. That's what family is supposed to be. Not blind loyalty, not silence, not control, but care. Real care doesn't worry about appearances. It worries about well-being. It doesn't ask, how do we look? It asks, are we okay? My grandson won't remember these early months. He won't remember the courtrooms or the quiet nights or the way his father once held him like he was afraid to breathe too loudly. But one day he'll grow up in a home where crying is answered, where comfort isn't rationed, where love isn't withheld as a lesson, and that will be enough. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, if you've ever been told to stay away, to back off, to mind your place, ask yourself this: was it really about boundaries, or was it about hiding? And if your instincts are whispering to you gently but persistently, don't be so quick to silence them. They exist for a reason. I didn't win anything through this. I didn't defeat anyone. I didn't come out triumphant. I came out honest. And sometimes that's the greatest victory there is. So I'll ask you this, because stories like mine aren't meant to end quietly. If you were in my place, if you saw something that didn't feel right, would you have spoken up? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you've lived through something similar, if you've had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting someone you love, know this: you're not alone, and you're not wrong for caring. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.
Even after the story ends, life keeps adding footnotes. They don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in grocery store aisles, in waiting rooms, in the way your body tenses when you hear a familiar name spoken by someone else. Months after everything settled, I ran into Rachel at the pharmacy. I almost didn't recognize her at first. Her hair was pulled back without care, her coat a size too big. She stood in line clutching a small box of something I couldn't see, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for weather that never quite passed. For a moment, I considered turning away, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't know what kindness looked like anymore between us. Then she turned and our eyes met. The recognition was instant. She hesitated, so did I. There was a time when I imagined what I would say if I ever stood face to face with her again. I imagined speeches, perfect sentences, the kind you rehearse in the shower and forget the moment you need them. But standing there with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a bored cashier tapping their fingers, all of that fell away. Rachel spoke first. "He's big now," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "he is." She nodded, swallowing. Her gaze drifted to the floor. "I'm learning," she said after a moment. "They're teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn." I believed her. Not because she asked for forgiveness, she didn't. Not because she looked remorseful enough, whatever that means. I believed her because she didn't try to justify herself. "I hope so," I said gently. We stood there, two women bound by a child neither of us had handled perfectly. When her turn came at the counter, she paid quickly and turned back to me. "I never meant to hurt him," she said. I met her eyes, steady. "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't always protect the vulnerable." She nodded once like someone accepting a truth they'd been avoiding, and then she left. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. That night I told Daniel about the encounter. He listened quietly, rocking his son as he did now without thinking, easy, natural. "Do you think she'll ever be okay?" he asked. "I think she'll be changed, and that's the best any of us can hope for." Some lessons don't arrive gently. They come wrapped in consequences. The baby, my grandson, took his first steps not long after that, right there in my living room on a rug that had seen too many years and too many spills.
He let go of the coffee table, wobbled, and then fell into Daniel's arms, laughing like he'd discovered a secret. We both cried. Not the quiet tears we'd grown used to, but the kind that catch you off guard and leave your chest sore afterward. Later, after he was asleep, Daniel sat beside me on the couch. "I don't think I ever told you how scared I was that day you stopped coming by." I waited. "I thought if I chose wrong, I'd lose everything," he continued, "so I chose nothing." I reached for his hand. "That's how fear works. It convinces us stillness is safety." He nodded slowly. "I won't do that again." And I believed him, not because he promised, but because he had learned the cost of silence. People still ask questions sometimes, not directly. They circle the truth, testing the air. I answer only what needs answering. I've learned that telling your whole story to everyone leaves you empty. Some chapters are meant only for those who lived them with you. The house has changed again, not dramatically, just enough to notice. There are crayon marks on the coffee table now, a small scuff on the wall where a toy truck hit too hard, the kind of imperfections that mark a life being lived. And me? I've changed too. I'm not as eager to be liked, not as afraid to be misunderstood. I trust myself more. I trust the quiet voice that once whispered, "Something isn't right," the voice I almost ignored. There's a dignity in standing your ground without shouting, in choosing action without cruelty, in letting justice unfold without forcing it to bleed. If there's one thing I carry forward from all of this, it's this. You don't need permission to protect what matters, not from family, not from tradition, not from fear of being labeled the problem. Sometimes being the problem is exactly what saves someone. My grandson will grow up hearing many stories, funny ones, ordinary ones, stories about scraped knees and birthday cakes and bedtime rituals. This story, the hardest one, will stay with me, not as a burden, but as proof. Proof that love, when it's real, doesn't look away, and that even in the quietest houses, courage can still find its voice.
As the years begin to layer themselves gently on top of one another, I find that the sharp edges of memory soften, but they never disappear. They don't need to. Some experiences aren't meant to fade. They're meant to shape. My grandson is a toddler now, curious, fearless. He walks with a kind of confidence that only comes from knowing, deep in his bones, that someone will catch him if he falls. He babbles endlessly, pointing at everything like the world is new and miraculous, which, to him, it is. Sometimes I watch him from the doorway, unseen, and marvel at how different his life already feels from those early days. There's warmth where there was once distance, response where there was silence, laughter where there was tension. Daniel has found his footing too. He moved into a small house not far from mine, a place with a yard just big enough for a plastic slide and a patch of grass that refuses to grow evenly. He jokes about it, but I see the pride in his eyes when he mows it himself. He's careful now, not guarded, but thoughtful. He listens more than he speaks. He asks questions he once assumed he already knew the answers to, and when something doesn't sit right with him, he doesn't push it down anymore. That change alone tells me everything I need to know. Rachel's presence remains structured and supervised. She's consistent, I'll give her that. She shows up when she's meant to. She follows instructions. She listens when professionals speak. She's learning to respond instead of control. I don't interfere. I don't comment. I don't hover. Because my role now isn't to manage the past. It's to model the future. There was a time when I thought being a good mother meant always stepping in, fixing, absorbing, making things easier for everyone else at my own expense. I know better now. Being a good mother and a good grandmother sometimes means standing firm and stepping back at the same time, knowing when to speak and when to let the lesson land where it needs to.
I've learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to smooth it over. I've learned that not everyone will understand your choices, and that's okay. Understanding isn't the price of doing the right thing. Some afternoons, I take my grandson to the park. I sit on the bench with a book I never really read, watching him toddle between the slide and the swings. Other grandparents sit nearby. We exchange smiles, sometimes stories. One woman once leaned over and said, "You can tell he's loved." I thanked her, my throat tight. Love leaves a mark, not a visible one, but a lasting one. It teaches children what to expect from the world and what to demand from it. At night, when the house grows quiet again, I still reflect, not with regret, but with awareness. I think about how close I came to staying silent, how easy it would have been to tell myself it wasn't my place, how tempting it would have been to believe that keeping access was more important than telling the truth. I think about the version of myself who stood in the kitchen holding that damp dish towel, wondering if she was about to lose everything. I wish I could reach back and tell her this: you won't lose what's meant for you. You'll lose what was built on silence, and that's not loss at all. I've been asked once or twice if I would do it all again. The question always catches me off guard, not because the answer is complicated, but because it's so simple. Yes. Not because it was easy, not because it felt good, but because it was necessary. Courage doesn't always feel like courage when you're inside it. Sometimes it feels like fear with nowhere left to hide. But when you come out the other side, you recognize it for what it was. I don't tell this story often in my daily life. It isn't something I offer casually. But when I do share it, when someone sits across from me with that familiar tightness in their chest, I watch their shoulders drop a little, like they've been given permission to trust themselves. That matters to me, because if my experience can help even one person speak up, pause, or act when something feels wrong, then it wasn't just something I survived. It was something I carried forward. My grandson laughs now when I sing to him, the same old lullaby Rachel once called outdated. His eyes flutter closed, his body softening with trust. Some things never go out of date. Love, presence, the courage to act when silence would be easier. Those are the things that endure. And as I sit here now, listening to the house breathe around me, I know this with certainty. I didn't break my family by telling the truth. I saved it.